folks, I wanted to do a follow-up video to the last couple videos I've done about the off-grid system. And the content of this video really comes from a lot of the questions that you've asked. And there's a number of questions that came out of this that I'm going to address in this video. And essentially what I want to do here is explain to you and give you 10 of my ideas on how you could do a system similar to mine, and spend about a third of what I spent. And I guess then the question is, well, why did I spend so much? Well, because I'm hardcore. And I like to do things balls to the walls. That's why. And I didn't have to do it this big, but I wanted to. And so that was my choice. And I like to kind of showcase things as the most hardcore as you can do them, because I'm in a position where I can do that. I'm done the sort of DIY phase of my life. In my earlier years when I was the urban farmer and I bootstrapped everything and I didn't have any money, I was in the DIY phase, and that was a part of my life then. But now I'm in a different part now. And so, but I still think people can get a lot of value out of the things that I'm showing. And often, people it's kind of annoying actually how some people complain, oh, well, how come it's not a DIY? I want to see how to do this cheap. It's like, well, then go and look at thousands of other YouTube videos on how you can do it DIY and cheap. But I'm going to address some of that in this video here, and I've got some notes on my phone here that I'll be pulling from, and I'll be kind of circling around different contexts because everybody's context isn't the same. And part of the reason why my system is as big as it is because I've chosen to stay living in the place that I'm in now, which is in southern BC, Canada. Sure, I could move somewhere warmer, but I don't want to. I like this place, and so I want to stay here. And that will be one of the ideas that I have for you. So before I get into it, if you haven't seen the last two videos that I've posted about this, I'll leave a link to them in the video here. I highly suggest you go and watch those. And so I do like to read the comments in the YouTube videos here, and I do answer questions as often as I can. And so if I'm not answering your question, it's because it was already answered in the other two videos. So you feel free to comment and ask any questions you want. But if you're not getting an answer, it's because it's in the last two videos, or you didn't listen closely enough. People have a tendency to comment when they're 2 minutes into a 20-minute video and ask a question that's answered in the video. So if I'm not answering your question, it's because of that. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to say on how you could do a system similar to mine at a third of the size or a third of the cost is start small and then build optionality into the system so that you can scale it. And that's actually what I did with this system. I mentioned that in the other videos, but I could add a whole other one of these rigs. So each of these rigs are 16 panels. The whole system is 20.8 kilowatts. I could add another 7 kilowatts of solar to this if I wanted to. All I would need is another charge controller. And technically, I could just add panels onto the charge controllers I already have. I have enough space for that. But I would probably just do another charge controller and have a separate rig wired in separately. So that you could do the same. You could essentially, because I have 3 charge controllers and 2 inverters, you could essentially do the same thing. Start with 1 inverter and 1 charge controller and start the system about a third of what mine is, and you could scale into it as you saw fit. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that a lot of people in different parts of the world do not need this size of a system. If you live in, anywhere south of Nebraska in the United States, you probably only need, at least at the worst case scenario, depending on the specifics of your climate and the specifics of the kind of weather you get in your winter, but you probably get enough daylight hours that far south, much further south than me, that you don't need this large of a system. This system was spec'd for winter. That's why I built this as big as it is. I knew that I wanted to get most of my solar in the winter, and we do get that with this. Even on days like this, it's still cloudy, but the sun's kind of breaking through here and there. We'll still harvest over 20 kilowatt hours today. So it's at this point of the winter, we're getting more than we need. And so I'm not needing to run the generator at all. But that would be the first thing I would say is start small, but make sure you build in room. So make sure you've got room to put in more inverters, room to put in more charge controllers. You've done all the necessary wiring so that you can upgrade if you feel that you need more. Because ultimately, you're going to need a generator. Every off-grid system needs a generator. And you're just going to burn more fuel on the front end. And that's okay because, the fuel, even with today's prices, is still reasonable for what you get out of it. So you can start small and then spend a little bit of that money up front on diesel and then later on scale up. So number 2 is do as much of the labor as you can. So even if you're not an electrician, you can do a lot of the labor in that you can, and I actually participated in a lot of the labor on this, not as much as I could have, but these solar panels, these are on these racks called Kinetic. That's a company out of Ontario. And there's these 3 big pads. I can just flip the camera around here and you can kind of see. They're on these concrete pads. And we formed those. And I had guys do most of the work, but I could have done that work myself. I could have, but my challenge is up here is I'm trying to do a lot in a relatively short period of time. Many people would take many years to get to the point that I am on my homestead. But like I said, I'm hardcore and I like to do things balls to the walls. So, but if you want to save a lot of money, you don't have to be an electrician. If you get your electrician to do, if you're an electrician, great. But you could assemble these racks yourself. You could pour the concrete yourself. You can help with running the wire. You can help with a lot of the labor. And so when I've said to people in the last 2 videos, my whole system has cost me 130 grand Canadian. That's everything. That's wire, equipment, labor, electricians. That's everything, right? So do as much of the labor as you possibly can. You can really bring your cost down because a good electrician is going to charge you, I don't know what rates are at different parts in the world, but around here, anywhere between 50, 70, maybe even $100 an hour. That's what a good electrician is going to charge. So another way you could save on your system by making it, having it be smaller, is start with everything being as energy efficient as possible. And that's one thing I didn't start with because we kind of came in. We had some appliances and things like that came from our other house that we wanted to just use. And so we're not using the most energy efficient for everything. Certainly once our house is finished, and that's where our house is going to go right here, we're going to be getting newer appliances and heat pump dryer and things like that. I hate LED lights. I mentioned this in the last video about the generator. I hate LED lights. And so I don't use LED lights on the inside of our house. The only place I use LED is on outside lights. And maybe in the house we'll have some hallway lights or some areas that are not as important. But for lights that we regularly use, I hate LEDs. I don't like them. I don't like the effects they have on my eyes and my vision. And I'm quite sensitive to it, and go and look into it yourself. And LEDs aren't the greatest thing for you, but but if you don't mind LEDs, hey, have at it. But that would be another thing is, so that's number 3. Start with everything energy efficient, and then that way your system is going to demand and use a lot less electricity up front. Another thing in regards to racking for solar is start with just a static rack. You can build a rack yourself out of lumber, out of 2x4s or 2x6s, and you could build a rack like this. And what I would suggest doing is start with one that's just static and just keep it in winter position. Right now, these are in winter position. And, you know, technically I could keep them in winter position all summer, because in the summer I have more electricity than I can use anyways. But I have an electric car and other things. If you watch those 2 other videos, I talk about this. I like to move them. I like to be able to get as much power as I possibly can all the time. But you don't necessarily need to do that. So a way you could save on these racks is just build them yourself. I met a guy in the lower mainland of BC this winter who did that, and he built the rack himself and saved a ton of money, because these racks that I have, I think they're probably more expensive now, of course, just like everything is. This system, it might seem expensive, but I spent 130,000 Canadian on everything. I probably would spend 30% more right now if I were to buy all this stuff again. And so I think these racks, these might be $6 or $7 grand each for each of this, for this whole panel rig, something like that. So if you built it yourself and you made it static and not moving, it would be a lot cheaper. So that's another one there. That's number 4. Number 5 is simply just, and it's kind of connected to some of the other ones I've mentioned here, is just burn more fuel now. So you could build a system, and again, you have to take into consideration the other things I've mentioned, is that you got to build in optionality so that you can expand your system, but you just burn more fuel on the front end, because fuel isn't really that expensive. I mean, for what you get out of fuel, I mean, petroleum products are incredibly efficient. As far as the amount of energy they store, I'm not speaking to the way the petroleum is pulled out of the ground or whatever. I'm not factoring any of that in, but just as far as how much square feet or cubic feet does this petroleum product take to store, and then how much energy units do I get out of it, it's incredibly efficient. So just burn more fuel in the short term, and you know, get yourself a decent sized generator. If I wanted to spend another, whatever it would have been, maybe another 10 grand, I would have got a 20 kilowatt generator, because what you want ideally with a generator is to run it for not that long and just top your batteries up really quickly. That's ideal. Our 13 kilowatt generator is actually somewhat under-spec'd for the size of our system. And some other things are sort of under-spec'd on my system, in the sense that for the size of my batteries, so I have 96 kilowatt hours of lithium iron phosphate batteries, I should technically have more solar for that many batteries, because how a system should be spec'd is that it should really only take a few hours to top up your batteries. So when we originally were designing this system, the guys that I hired to help to source all this equipment for me and do the initial install, they only spec'd 30 kilowatt hours of batteries. And that was because on a day, like if I get full sun and it breaks through this, I've seen this go up to, actually just recently, up to 17 kilowatts producing per hour. So if I had 30 kilowatt hours of batteries, it would only take, you know, a couple hours to just charge the batteries completely. That's ideally what you want. But I wanted to have a lot of battery storage to carry me through these dark parts of the winter. And this is kind of where the real specifics of the context of the place that you live in and your needs is really important. It's ultimately the most important thing. What you specifically want and how your lifestyle works and where you are, the devil's in the details. And a lot of people say, oh, I wouldn't need this or that. And that's like, yeah, you probably wouldn't, but you're not me. So that's one thing there. Number 6, this is a good one for a lot of people who are trying to escape the rat race and get out of the cities and are trying to find ways to, how do you pay for this stuff? You know, most people, you know, how do you do it? And for most of my life, I didn't make very much money. And even when I was farming, I was making, you know, bringing home 50 to 70 grand net for myself. Still, when you have a family and you've got a lot of other expenses, it's actually not that much money. And so how do you put money into doing something like this? Well, you can cooperate with your friends and your family. A lot of people are buying land cooperatively, getting on a homestead cooperatively, building maybe multiple residences on a piece of property. Just don't use that term residence, because that has all kinds of loaded legal meanings into it. Won't get into that in this video, but do something like that. Like this system that we've put in is essentially a microgrid. I'm planning to build another house behind this solar panel. It's going to be a 3-car garage basically, but I'm going to put a little kind of in-law suite on top of it, and that'll be tied in. A system this size could service multiple families technically. So, and that's what we're preparing for. We're preparing to kind of just be the last people standing or some of the last people standing once people get forced into the smart grid cities and have to use the digital ID and the digital currency and eat the bugs and take the shots. We're gonna hold out, and we're not going to be participating in any of that. So we're preparing eventually for more of our relatives to end up here at some point. So you could do the same thing, as you could fund this kind of thing by just cooperating with your best friends or your family. Another one here. So number 7 is limiting your loads by properly managing things. So I'll give you a couple examples of what we did. I mentioned this in the last video too, is I have a little timer on my Starlink internet that turns it off basically for our sleeping hours so that it's not drawing power. And yes, Starlink has a timer in the app. I've discovered this as well, but I don't trust Starlink. So I like manual things that it's turning off, and nobody can manipulate that otherwise. So that's another thing. Another thing we did was I used it's called an Intermatic Timer. And I put this on our domestic electric hot water tank that we use during the sunnier and warmer times of the year. Right now we're using propane on demand, but once our house is finished, we'll be using our wood boiler and our wood cook stove in the house to heat water as well. So we'll have kind of multiple redundancies there. But check out an Intermatic Timer. It's a really neat thing where you can basically put a timer right after your breaker, and you could have certain things just turn off or on automatically. And so again, this comes down to limiting your use, but when you're off grid, you have to accept certain limitations. I mean, at the same time, part of why I built such a big system is so that we would have less limitations. But you can do the same thing. You could just say, hey, the lights are going to turn off automatically at 9 p.m. Or you could have, like I said, with the domestic hot water, okay, that's going to turn off at a certain time and it'll come back on at another time. So you can create limitations in your system with these timers, and that can reduce your load, thereby you don't need to have as big of a system. So another one is number 8. If you have the ability to start on the grid, start on the grid. Start with a grid tie system, and if you want to eventually be off grid, build that in afterwards. But if the grid's available for you, use it. See, the grid wasn't available for me. Well, it was, but it would have cost me the same to build my system as to bring the grid up here. Maybe a little bit less. Like, I had a linesman come up and look, and just because of our geography and how steep it is from the main road, because there is power at our main road, but it would have cost me about $100,000 to get on the grid. So why would I do that? I don't personally, I don't want to be on the grid. I don't want Klaus Schwab and his cronies turning off my power. So we wanted to be off grid, and it was about a difference of $30,000 to be off the grid than to be on the grid. So that's why I'm off the grid. But I would say if you have grid power or you're close to the grid, start on the grid. And, you know, if you share my values and you want to be off grid because you don't want some technocrat deciding when you can have electricity or not, or your social credit score is too low and you don't get any power this month, and you didn't eat enough bugs and you ate too much grass-fed beef last month, and so we're going to turn your power off. Right? I'm rambling, but you can start with the grid and it's way cheaper. I mean, my first solar system at our house in Kelowna, which we sold over a year ago, was a grid tied system. We eventually put batteries in to be a grid tied system with batteries, but you know, you can start that way. And I have a friend in the area here who's doing exactly that. He's built it in grid tied, and he basically has put in a big breaker, is that if, you know, if the grid ever goes down, he just flips a breaker, and then his whole off-grid system is now operational. So that would be one thing to consider. Number 9 is consider moving to a place with more sun. You know, like I said, I wanted to live here because this is the area that I know, and I like the culture here. I like the country that I live in. I've figured out how to navigate it to find the highest level amount of freedom as possible. So I'm comfortable living here. I'm not afraid of Justin Trudeau and his, you know, fascism in pink with a rainbow swastika. I'm not afraid of that. It doesn't affect me. So I'm content being where I am, but you might want to move. And so if you want to move to some parts of the United States, or move to, hey, maybe you want to live in Mexico or wherever, you know, you don't need to have nearly as big of a system as I do. Especially even other parts of Canada are far sunnier in the winter. There's parts of southern Ontario that are sunny all the time in the winter, and you probably would only need a third of this system to be set up there, and then, hey, run a generator for the time that you don't get sun. And then my last one, number 10, this is at your own risk, and this will probably trigger some liberal snowflakes out there, but you don't have to get everything with a permit. Okay, you don't have to have everything CSA approved. CSA approved, if you're in Canada, is a really classic sort of government racket where they put a stamp on a piece of technology and it all of a sudden is worth 3 or 4 times more. So I actually, on this system, I'll tell you, I didn't get CSA approved batteries because we're off grid and we're out of the way and nobody's coming up here without permission. So we just did, our batteries aren't CSA approved. I bought batteries from the United States, and when we spec'd this system originally, the batteries that they wanted to sell me were a CSA approved battery, and they cost the same amount as the batteries I have now for a third of the kilowatt hours. So the original batteries were they were a slightly different battery. They weren't a lithium iron phosphate battery. They were something else, but they were only 30 kilowatt hours and they were 30 grand. Whereas I went to a place down in the United States and got the batteries that I have now that are amazing, and I got 96 kilowatt hours of battery for the same price. They just don't have that government stamp on them that says they're CSA approved. So, you know, you got to have electricians that are willing to not care about that, and or do it yourself. But that is that's a huge one there, because if you don't care about that stuff, when you're off grid, right? You don't have to play by the same rules as everybody that's on the grid, and that's partly why we wanted to be off grid. We want to do things our way. I want to row my own boat, right? I want to make my own decisions. So there you go, folks. There's 10 things there, and I hope some people get some value out of that and realize that you don't have to do everything the same way that I've done them. You know, everybody has their own context. Everybody has their own situation and life circumstances that makes their own situation unique to themselves. And so you can do it that way. All right, folks. If you guys like that, please smash the like, share the videos with your friends, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Check out my site, fromthefield.tv. It's where I post all my vlogs and the vast majority of all my content. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one.